So it's my great joy to welcome our speaker for today. Our presenter is Jeremy Lent. He's described by Guardian journalist George Monbiot as one of the greatest thinkers of our age. He's known as an integrator, an author, and a speaker. He was born in London, received a BA in English literature from Cambridge University and an MBA from University of Chicago, and was a former internet company CEO. He's also the founder of the Deep Transformation Network, a global community exploring pathways to an ecological civilization, and the nonprofit Lyology Institute, dedicated to fostering an integrated worldview. He's authored award-winning books, and among them are The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, and The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. He's also written extensively about visions and pathways toward an ecological civilization. And today he's joined us and going to talk about weaving a web of meaning, how recognizing our deep interrelatedness lays a path to sustainable flourishing. Please, Jeremy, floor is yours.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Gail. And what I'd like to do is actually, without really further ado, share my screen to take you through the presentation I'll give today, and I look forward to the questions at the end of it. So let me share. And what, as you see, as Gail said, today we're going to be talking about actually themes from my more recent book, The Web of Meaning, Weaving a Web of Meaning, How Recognizing Our Deep Interrelatedness Lays the Path to Sustainable Flourishing. But to set some context for this, I want to kind of move a little bit outside of the zone of just religion and science for a few minutes, because I think setting the context helps us to recognize how crucially important this theme of the intersection of religion and science is in our world today. And so to do that, what we're going to do is begin from kind of zooming out a bit and contemplating the Earth, our only home. And right now, the only planet that we know of anywhere in the known universe where life exists. And as of course, many of you know, life actually first arose on this beautiful planet billions of years ago. And went through many different phases, but it's only been really the last couple of 100,000 years that a particular species developed the capability to actually affect the entire system of life on this amazing, unique planet, as far as we know. So we need to ask ourselves this question: how are we doing? And the rather terrifying answer is we're doing really badly right now. And what we need to do is look around at the news any day to look at these harbingers of a daunting future around the world: wildfires, floods, droughts. And of course, it's no news to any of you here that these are all the results of the climate emergency we're facing. And I'm sure you're familiar with some sort of slide, some sort of graph that looks like this, that at current policies, we're heading really towards probably a 3°C rise in temperature in the Earth this century, which scientists call catastrophic. And even if we suddenly like do some pretty dramatic reversals of that and actually manage to end up at something between 1.5 to 2 degrees rise by the end of the century, even that's been called a prescription for disaster because of these cascading, amplifying feedbacks that that system scientists are becoming aware of and are communicating about. But here's the thing: even if we were to suddenly find some sort of magic bullet that could solve the climate emergency, we need to realize that it's actually just a symptom of a far deeper underlying problem, which is the vast ecological destruction that we are causing across the board. To just give you a sense of a few basic statistics, we have witnessed a 69% decline in animal populations worldwide since just 1970. And because of that and other factors, scientists tell us now that we've actually begun the 6th great extinction of species since life began on Earth. Over these last billions of years, the other extinctions happened through cosmological or geological events. This one is caused by one species, our species. We're looking, unless there's a dramatic change, in the virtual annihilation of coral reefs worldwide this century. And the UN reports that 95% of Earth's land will be degraded by the middle of this century. But of all statistics, I think the one that kind of blows my mind the most is this one, that by 2050, at current rates, there will be more plastic by weight in the ocean than fish. And all this is the result of what scientists look at these issues are called the Great Acceleration, and which has really happened since the Second World War, the end of the Second World War. And just kind of one look at this graph gives you a real sense of what they mean by that great acceleration. Virtually every measure of human production and consumption has just been exploding and continues to. In fact, mainstream economists project that this whole level of production and consumption is actually going to triple. With all that damage so far, is going to triple by 2060, which is why scientists are warning that we're rapidly heading for a precipice. A group of scientists led by Johan Rockström developed a model to look at what they call a safe operating space for humanity. And they identified planetary boundaries that we need to stay within. And those boundaries are defined by that green in the middle. So they've already identified that we've blown through at least 5 of the 9 boundaries they've identified. So scientists are warning us, like world scientists from around the world saying soon it'll be too late to shift course from our failing trajectory, that there's a very big risk we'll end our civilization. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres talks about it just recently as collective suicide. So we might obviously ask, how did we get to this place? What did we do to get on this crazy course we're on? And I looked at that in some detail in an earlier book that I wrote some years back called The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. And one thing that arose from that study that I did looked all the way the different ways that cultures make meaning out of the universe from earliest times to the present, is that culture shapes values. Those values shape history. And by the same token, our values are what will shape the future. So we need to turn and look at, well, what are our values? And I feel like they can really best be crystallized, if you will, by a picture like this. Our values are based on separation. Here we see these people separate from each other, connected with their technology, even separate from the food they're about to eat, not even thinking where it might have come from. And underlying pictures like this, there's a story, a modern story of separation that most people take for granted without ever actually thinking about it, but it underlies almost every way in which they make sense of the world. This modern story tells us things like nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature, that humans are separate from each other, that human progress arises from the conquest of nature, and the earth is basically a resource to exploit for human benefit. And as a result of all that, basically the purpose of life is really just to get wealthy and powerful. Now, more recently, in this book that I wrote, The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe, I showed us how that modern story of separation is not just dangerous and leading us on this path towards potential catastrophe, but is plain false. And in that book, and in the presentation I'm about to take you through now, what I do is look at if we look at modern sciences like neuroscience, complexity science, evolutionary biology, systems sciences, we find that they point to the same underlying truths as sources of traditional wisdom like indigenous knowledge, Taoism, Buddhism. Basically, they point to the recognition of our intrinsic interconnectedness. And as we go on this exploration of what that means and the rest of this presentation, I'm going to structure it basically by the existential questions that pretty much every human being asks in one form or other at some point in their lives. Questions like, who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? And ultimately, why am I? So let's begin with this first one. Who am I? Now, if you just basically stop somebody in the street and ask them a question about that is phrased something like this, it's likely they'll give you an answer that is based in one form or other on what has now become like the most famous really statement of philosophy, the sort of foundation stone of Western philosophy, if you will, that statement that we all know from Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And if you look at what that statement actually says, it's basically saying that our human identity exists solely through our conceptualizing faculty. Now, when Descartes came up with this foundational statement, he thought he was being radical and trying to not basically jettison all the history of thought that had been received, so he could really try to come up with the essence of reality. But in fact, the irony is that he was essentially coming up with a modern, at that time, interpretation of a foundation stone of Western thought goes all the way back to Plato, which basically, and in this picture from the Renaissance, Aristotle's the person sort of focusing down and Plato's pointing up, because his idea was that the rational soul of each human being is that link to divinity. And that's what Descartes accepted deeply in his understanding. And as a result of that, it leads to this implication that if human identity through that rational soul is what makes us divine, in his eye, gives us identity itself, then animals and our bodies, but don't have that identity. They're basically just mere machines. But more recently, ethologists, people who study animal behavior, have explained very clearly that animals are most definitely not machines. We now know, for example, that elephants communicate over hundreds of miles through infrasound. They perform ceremonies over dead family members. We understand now that dolphins and whales talk to each other, even in local dialects. They call each other by name. They're even thought to gossip about those who are temporarily absent. Wolves, we understand now, display deep family commitment, and the males help raise the young until they reach maturity. But it's one thing to look at the kind of wisdom or understanding of these kind of high-functioning mammals. But now we understand through plant scientists that even plants actually have a networked intelligence. In fact, plants have a distributed intelligence, and they perceive the world through up to 20 different senses. Plants are now understood to act intentionally and purposefully. They learn. They have memories. We now know they communicate with each other through the what biologist Suzanne Simard calls the wood wide web, connecting with mycorrhizal fungal network underground. And through that same mycorrhizal fungal network, they even allocate resources as a community. But here's where it gets even more amazing. Cellular biologists who study the tiniest little cell, of which each of us has about 40 trillion of them in our bodies, have discovered that even a single cell actually displays stunning intelligence. A single cell has thousands of different sensors and proteins. It sends and receives hundreds of signals at the same time. It's aware of itself and others. It basically knows what to do. Cells, we now understand, cooperate in community, and they even make decisions as groups. Now, while modern science is just beginning to understand this stunning intelligence of nature, this would not be so new to other cultures outside of our Western tradition. And if we turn to a very different tradition, to ancient China, thousands of years ago, thousands of miles from the West, many of you are going to be familiar with the Tao Te Ching, what's known as the classic of the Tao and De. And you probably have some idea, I bet, of what Tao means. And basically, it translates to something like way or path. And it's how the forces of nature manifest in the world. But what people are less well aware of is this word de in the title, which refers to the idea the Taoists had of the kind of spontaneity, the intrinsic nature that is inherent in all living things. And when they looked at the world around them, they looked at how animals and plants acted, and they saw that state of acting with de, and they gave it a name of Wu Wei, which can be translated as like effortless action. And they, by their perception, basically all non-human organisms act naturally in Wu Wei, with animals, birds, plants, you name it. So the Taoists asked themselves, what happened to humans? Because if all other animals acted in this Wu Wei effortless action, humans seem to have this way of acting more purposively, what they called Yu Wei, the opposite of Wu Wei. And purposive action, they would be things like using a fire to dry up a well, or say forcing water uphill to irrigate a mountainside. And we might say, well, aren't those the very things that define us as human beings, that's what civilization basically is based on? And the Taoists would say, absolutely. And they developed a theory of civilization, basically, which can be summarized by one of their great sages, Zhuangzi, which was essentially that in earliest times, men of old lived in what he called a state of perfect unity. And people lived in common with the birds and beasts on terms of equality with all creatures, like one family. But then, according to Zhuangzi, people began everywhere to get suspicious, and with orchestras and ceremonies, they began to be separated from one another. Now, modern neuroscientists, when they look at the evolution of us as a human species, basically validate that original concept from the Taoists. And what we now know from modern neuroscience is that the prefrontal cortex is what mediates that cognition that the Taoists called Yu Wei, that purposive action. And neuroscientists recognize that the prefrontal cortex is uniquely advanced in humans than any other mammal, and it mediates our symbolic thought, our conceptualizing, planning, and creating abstractions. And when anthropologists look at how civilization did emerge in earliest human history, they see that it was that symbolic thought that led to that led to the emergence of language, culture, arts, and tool making, just like the Taoists said. So now we can begin to recognize that we actually have a dual human consciousness. We have this conceptual consciousness that's analytic, slow, rational, and effortful, which corresponds to the Yu Wei and to that thinking, I think, therefore I am cognition that Descartes thought about. But we also have an animate consciousness that really connects us with all other mammals around us, one that is intuitive, fast, emotional, and effortless. And that is what allows us as humans to also have that kind of Wu Wei spontaneous activity. So from that, we can begin to recognize that really our human challenge is to integrate both of those systems in harmony, and not just think that our pure identity is just, I think, therefore I am, that thinking capacity. So now when we begin to look at that first question, who am I? We can begin to answer it with something like this, like I am a mind-body organism capable of integration. So let's move to this next question. Where am I? And again, if you ask anybody kind of in the mainstream world to talk about basically our universe, they'll give you some conception, most likely, of a sense of a split universe, a sense that there is some sort of transcendent God or something separate from the material universe, the material world. And there's separate dimensions to that. And again, we can trace that all the way back to Plato. And that notion of dualism, like Plato and many of the early Greeks and the tradition that came from that, saw some sacred element of the universe as being fixed and perfect, separate from the polluted material world. And so all of these thousands of years later, we're in this place where religion and science are believed to exist by many people in different domains. I'm sure many of you have probably heard of this concept of the principle of non-overlapping magisteria, which was defined by Stephen Jay Gould some decades back. He talked about how science tries to document the factual character of the natural world. Religion operates in the realm of purpose, meaning, values, and these two magisteria do not overlap. And he was basically just kind of reframing something that said, a famous statement by Jacques Monod at the beginning of the 20th century, who said, any mingling of knowledge with values is unlawful, forbidden. And this idea continues to the present day. In fact, just in a statement by the National Academy of Sciences just a couple of decades ago, they're very clear about their view. Science and religion occupy two separate realms of human experience. Demanding they be combined detracts from the glory of each in their view. And it's that kind of split between a sense of transcendent meaning separate from the material world that really allows this this kind of dichotomy we have, where it's considered okay to pray to that source of transcendent meaning, even while we ransack nature below. But other cultures never had this kind of conceptual split that we have in the Western tradition. And if we go again to China, and this time look back to about 1,000 years ago, during the Song dynasty in China, what we find there was a certain group of thinkers, they call themselves the School of the Tao, who integrated three great sources of wisdom traditions in East Asia: Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. And even though they call themselves the School of the Tao, we know them nowadays by the term Neo-Confucianism. And they were around for centuries, and many generations of great philosophers and thinkers arose from that tradition. And the Neo-Confucianists emphasized their understanding of the universe not on fixed laws of nature like we think of in the West, but underlying principles. And for the Neo-Confucians, the entire universe consists basically of qi, they called it, which we can think of basically as matter and or energy, the stuff of the universe, and what they called li, which refer to the principles by which the qi is connected. And when they looked at all the principles of those connections of everywhere in the universe, they saw the totality of all that li in the universe basically as the Tao. Now, if we fast forward back to modern times, we see that modern system sciences also points to a connected universe. We're talking about disciplines like complexity science, systems biology, or chaos theory. And what they share is this recognition that everything is connected, but in non-linear ways. Some of you may know that famous statement from Edward Lorenz, the founder of chaos theory, he asked that question: is it possible that the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil could cause a tornado in Texas through that nonlinear connection? And what all of these different sciences have in common is recognizing that the interactions between things frequently tell us more about them than the things themselves. Whether we're looking at starlings flocking in the sky, or schools of fish in the ocean, or the ripples of sand dunes, or even the entire global weather or climate system of Earth, or even the ways in which galaxies are structured, it's oftentimes the way in which they interrelate that tell us more than the actual stuff they're made of. The li, it maybe tells us more than the qi in Neo-Confucian terms. And this is kind of a difficult thing sometimes for people in a Western mode of thought to get their heads around. So I'm going to offer you just a very brief kind of practice to try to recognize that. Maybe for a moment, try to bring to your mind a photograph of yourself when you were a little child. Here's one of me when I was a little kid. And when I look at that picture, I know that's me. I may even have some memories to prove it. But here's what's amazing. Virtually every cell in that little boy is no longer in me now. And there are some cells that do stay in the body throughout one's entire life, but even those cells are continually changing their constituent parts. And so I can be virtually certain that there's probably not a molecule that was in that little boy that is in me now. And yet I know that's me. So what is it that connects me to that little boy? Basically, it's not the stuff that little boy was made of. It's not the chi, but it's the principles of connection between the different elements, molecules and proteins and cells, and all those ways in which they were connected that actually remains more resilient and actually is my true essence of who I am, not the actual stuff I'm made of. And when scientists look at understanding these interactions between things in nature, they see that oftentimes they take a certain pattern, which they call fractal. Basically, fractals are patterns that repeat themselves at different scales. They indicate self-organized activity, and they're everywhere in the natural world, from coastlines to leaves, to lightning, to lungs, to neurons in our brain. So scientists have begun to see nature itself as basically a fractally connected system, where each cell is organized ultimately according to the organism of which it's part, which again is a fractal part of its species, which is a fractal part of that ecosystem. And each ecosystem ultimately is a fractal part of the living earth or of Gaia. So now when we begin to look at this question, where am I, from a more informed perspective, rather than seeing ourselves in the split universe, we can begin to see ourselves as being part of a fractally connected, self-organized universe. So let's turn to this next question. What am I? Well, if we look at really wise words from one of the Neo-Confucian sages from the Song Dynasty from 1,000 years ago, Chu Shi, he said something very profound. He said, if one wishes to know the reality of Tao, one must seek it in one's own nature. So again, if we look to our modern conception of what is our nature, what the mainstream understanding of that is, well, most people will very likely begin that understanding based on this concept from Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene that went sort of viral decades ago and really began to sort of found a mainstream sort of quasi-scientific understanding of life. And in his words in that book, he said, we and all other animals are machines created by our genes in a highly competitive world. And so a predominant quality to be expected in a successful gene is ruthless selfishness. And what most people understand about the gene, based on not just Dawkins, but many others in some of the earlier understandings of genetics from decades ago, is that the gene is the fundamental unit of evolution. It dictates everything about the organism, and that it's inherently selfish and competitive. But what recent findings in modern molecular biology show us is that every one of those statements we think in mainstream thinking are true are actually false. In fact, it turns out that genes are part of an iterative process with the cell. Rather than the gene dictating to the cell, it's really part of a vibrant, dynamic, circular flow of interactivity. And modern biologists tell us we should think of the genotype more like an artist's palette, like a repertoire of capabilities that the cell can select based on its particular needs as determined by the environment. And to get you a sense of how profoundly important this is, think of a sweet little animal like a grasshopper, like solitary, gentle, munching there all alone on a leaf. Well, it turns out that grasshopper has exactly the same DNA as a massive herd of locusts, which, as we know, can collect in aggressive swarms and devour like hundreds of thousands of acres of land. Exactly the same DNA, but at certain times, the grasshopper, based on different cues from the environment, will actually change different gene expressions within its DNA and actually change its physical and even its personality to become a locust with others around it. Now, biologists, as they started to look at the implications of this new understanding of biology, have developed what's known as an extended evolutionary synthesis, which, in the words of one of the leaders in epigenetic biology, Eva Jablonka, is a profound, radical, and fascinating transformation of evolutionary theory. We see this in fields like developmental plasticity, epigenetic inheritance, what's known as niche construction, principles of coevolution, cultural evolution. But all of these different disciplines basically lead to one fundamental new understanding of life, that if we look at the evolution of the complexity of life since it began billions of years ago on Earth, there have only been a few major transitions in that complexity, when single cells became complex cells or eukaryotes, and then when multicellular life arose, and then when simple animals first emerged, and then mammals. And in each of these cases, those jumps in the complexity of life came about not through selfish genes competing, but through increases in cooperation. Like in the words of the great cellular biologist Lynn Margulis, life did not take over the world by combat, but by networking. Life evolved its richness and complexity through cooperation. And we see this when we walk any day in the forest, anywhere in the world. What you see is this incredible complex web of mutually beneficial symbiosis taking place, where plants photosynthesize from the sun and provide nourishment for the other animals. Insects pollinate those plants. Animals transport their seeds and they fertilize the soil. The fungus regenerates all the dead matter, and those mycorrhizal networks will even transport nutrients like we looked at from one tree in the forest to another. So, and now as we look at what are we can get to realize that as organisms, we are self-organized, fractal, dynamic patterns. In the words of systems biologist Carl Woese, organisms are resilient patterns in a turbulent flow, patterns in an energy flow. And as he's saying, it's become increasingly clear, we have to see us, if we want to understand ourselves in a deep sense, we need to see ourselves not as machines, but as stable, complex, dynamic organization. And it's that organization that basically forms a fractal cascade of abundance that gives us the richness of life on Earth today. So now as we look at this question, what am I? Here we can begin to answer it by saying, actually, I am a resilient pattern of self-organized cooperation. So let's look at this profoundly important question. How should I live? And again, if we start with a mainstream understanding of that, well, the dominant culture will tell us, well, humans are intrinsically selfish and greedy. And those words from Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street decades ago, greed is good. Selfish behavior by individuals is in the best interests of everyone. And that's the underlying ideology of neoliberalism, which has now become the dominant ideology that drives our economics and our media and our way of thinking around the world. And even those, and to his credit, like Richard Dawkins, who does not subscribe to that ideology, believe that we need to then overcome our selfish genes. And in Dawkins's words, let's try to teach generosity and altruism because we're born selfish. Let's us understand what our selfish genes are up to, because then maybe we can upset their designs. But actually, what we now understand from modern psychologists and anthropologists, that humans actually evolved to be cooperative. Early hominids, millions of years ago, were vulnerable to predators. Those who learned to collaborate, they're in the savannah, they left the forest. Those who learned to collaborate were the most successful. And over millions of years, our pre-human identity expanded from self and kin to include the entire group. And the human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, is actually what differentiates us from other primates. And as a result of that, we developed what psychologists call our moral emotions. Things like compassion, shame, guilt, gratitude, or embarrassment. These are things that we deeply feel within us. And so we don't just act morally because we think we should overcome those selfish genes. We do so because it actually feels right to us. And this is something that indigenous cultures around the world developed their traditions and their way of behaving on that basis. In Africa, there's this profoundly important word, Ubuntu, which basically translates as I am because you are. In North America, the Lakota tribe, for example, have this concept of Mitakuye Oyasin, we are all related. And they're not just talking about just the group of people they're next to, but all of life around them. So we begin to realize that our human flourishing is based on our intrinsic connectedness within ourselves, with others, with the natural world, and with the entire living earth. And the human flourishing itself, just like the rest of those natural systems we looked at, is fractal, where each human mind-body organism basically is fractally connected with community, and each community is fractally connected with the living earth. And we discover that actually our values themselves basically are a function of our identity. If I identify just as an individual, I'll probably hold values like that it's okay to exploit others and inherited wealth is okay and value my autonomy. If I identify mostly with my community, I might hold community values like solidarity, in-group favoritism, and maybe parochialism. If I identify with a particular ideology, I might hold values around nationalism or religiosity or fundamentalism. If I identify with all of humanity, maybe my values might expand to include things like justice and dignity and human rights. And ultimately, if I identify with all of life, I might live according to life-affirming values like reverence for life, a healthy planet, and natural flourishing, which was really best expressed, I think, by the great 20th century humanitarian Albert Schweitzer, who said, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. And as a result, he said, I cannot but have reverence for all that is called life. That is the beginning and foundation of morality. So then when we look at this question, how should I live? We can begin to explore the answer to that from that foundation point, that I should live in reverence and care for all life. So let's turn to this final question. Why am I? And if we start again by looking at what our mainstream worldview tells us, probably a great starting point is the famous Nobel Prize-winning scientist, physicist, Steven Weinberg, who was a famous spokesperson for reductionism. And in his words, it became like a classic statement for this. He said, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. But if we begin to understand meaning itself as being a function of connectedness in these systems way of looking at things that we've looked at, we realize that as the number of connections increases, they lead to a phase transition and the emergence of new meaning. In fact, we can begin to understand meaning itself as basically being an emergent phenomenon enacted by a conscious entity as it relates an experience to other experiences. So think of it like, say, a word by itself has no meaning, but when all words connect, language emerges. When organisms connect, an ecosystem emerges. When neurons connect, consciousness emerges. And so from that perspective, we can see that Steven Weinberg's sense of the pointless universe can actually be seen in a very different way if we see the universe more as, according to this great story from early Buddhism of Indra's web, of a continual, infinite, inconnecting web of jewels. And then we begin to see that rather than looking at whether the universe is pointless or not, we see that each point itself is really a node that only connects to other nodes, and it contains meaning to the extent of that connection in that web of meaning. And I'm sure many of you have had that kind of peak, some sort of peak experience in your life, of the sense of that deep connectedness. And so what we understand now from systems understanding is that sense of that oneness doesn't have to be seen as separate from a scientific understanding, but actually as validating, as a deep embodied realization of what science is actually telling us, which is that we live in this vast fractal universe with patterns that are both recognizable and forever unfolding, patterns that are mysterious beyond human comprehension, and yet manifesting a deeply meaningful harmony that permits us, with reverence and awe, to touch into its unfathomable glory, which can really lead us to maybe a definition of spirituality from this lens of seeing spirituality itself as basically seeking meaning in the coherent connections between things rather than in the things themselves. So we begin to realize that we kind of live essentially in this ocean of Li, that everything we do in our lives creates these Li ripples, these ripples in our patterns, in our principles of connecting, creates Li ripples in the fabric of existence. And each Li ripple really contains parts of our unique spirit, which leads to ultimately a principle of the ultimate connectivity of everything in the cosmos. We exist in an ocean of Li, and those Li ripples exist within each of us. And the choices we make, the personal choices and actions, choices to participate, for example, in regenerative community, choices to engage in the broader political process, all of these choices are basically what we can and are doing to weave the web of meaning. So finally, when we look at this question, why am I? We can begin to start answering that question from this idea that actually I am here on this universe to weave my part in the web of meaning. And if maybe enough of us make those connections and move that towards engagement, maybe we just might be able to regenerate our beautiful, fragile earth sometime this century. So that's one of my prepared talk I've taken you through. The book this comes from is called The Web of Meaning. And you can connect with me on these websites, and also an online global community called the Deep Transformation Network, which I'm connected with, and I invite you to explore it and to join it if you'd like. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and turn back to you, Gail, I think.
Yes, yes. Thanks so much, Jeremy. That was a fabulous presentation. I want to remind our viewers that they can enter questions into the Q&A, and already we're getting comments that was beautiful. We have a respondent today. We're really fortunate to have with us Reverend Twinkle Marie Manning. She's senior minister for the Church of Kineo in Rockwood and the contract minister for the Universalist Church of Waterville in Maine. She's an interfaith minister, a poet, an author, an artist, and an award-winning TV producer. She's the creator and executive producer of TV for Your Soul and leads the Empowering Women TV project. She curates the Women of Spirit and Reflection and Blessing books series by Matrika Press. With that, I'm going to introduce Twinkle and ask her to give her response to Jeremy. Thank you, Twinkle.
Thank you.
Hi, Twinkle.
Hi, Jeremy. Good to see you. Thank you so much for that. I guess as a respondent, I should probably come up with something incredibly challenging, but I agree with everything that you said. But having said that, my curiosity is where religion and spirituality connect with the scientific theories, specifically how our spiritual lives, if transformed with our interrelatedness, can connect the ill-fated trajectory we seem to be racing towards. And if there is a place for transformational spiritual practices to be a compass to a better future. David Foster Wallace once proclaimed, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. And he asserts that everybody worships. The only choice we really get is what to worship.
Mm.
He goes on to say an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or goddess or spiritual path or noble truth is Because if we do not choose, if we do not have some core set of ethical principles to abide, that life will eat us alive.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems that in an acutely measurable sense, certainly from your presentation, the resulting world we now occupy is one that has largely been co-created by, if I may, the worship of such things that serve not only to distract us from what once was an innate sense of oneness with life, it has diverged to implicitly focus or implicitly worship, by any other name, toward striving to achieve that which is unattainable. And that worship is destroying us from the inside out.
Mm-hmm.
Whether worshiping allure and imperishable beauty, worshiping intelligence or creative mastery, worshiping money and power. And even if one has these things, they will inevitably live in fear that they are not enough. They'll feel weak and strive for attaining even more. And each in their own way contributing to the ever accelerating demise of our harmony in our world, of peace of mind, of relationships, close and en masse. Such distractions enhancing feelings of being separate from one another, alone, lonely. Desperation can and indeed does set in. And in humankind's collective desperation, rather than focusing on what we innately feel, our connectedness, many are doubling down on carving out even more unique identities for themselves in singular pursuits to attain some sense of power in their lives and power over others sharing life with them.
Yeah.
We are on an unsustainable trajectory. Of
Mm-hmm.
that we can, I believe, absolutely agree. And more immediately, the status quo is untenable for most of humankind.
Mm-hmm.
I want to believe that it's possible for humans to overcome our propensity for mental distraction, indeed mental destruction, and begin to behave in ways which are in alignment with our interconnectedness. We are connected scientifically and spiritually. We are part of the wonders of the universe, and such ideas are not new, and they are not news to most of us. From Jesus teaching to love one's neighbor as oneself, to the Buddha describing the reality of nature, the reality of life as oneness.
Mm-hmm.
The wisdom has been given to us in the words of our poets, such as Anne Bradstreet, writing in amazement back in her day as she gazed upon the glistening sun, whose beams were shaded by tree leaves. Even so, softly she said, "What glory is like to thee, soul of this world, this universe's eye, wonders thee a deity." And unequivocally, in the words through a spiritual channel, Jane, you are so part of the world that your slightest action contributes to its reality. Your breath changes the atmosphere. Your encounters with others alter the fabric of their lives and the lives of those who come in contact with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we are connected.
Yeah.
Yet even when we know this to be true, it is difficult to develop the individual discipline, the willpower needed to achieve sustainable actions that support what most of us claim we want, and certainly what our world needs. As such, going solo as a method of affirming interconnectedness is, well, ill-advised. So alternately, the societal and the global leadership levels, they could have mechanisms for helping cultivate sustainable group modeled actions. Yet there they have an undeniable history of inherent, shall we say, motivational flaws, while humankind has much to lose. The reigning leadership, of which admittedly we are all in some way a part, are inclined towards maintaining the prerogative. So thus to date, it's inhibiting viable solutions to everything from food sovereignty to sufficient housing, safe communities, environmental issues, healthcare, families in crisis, crimes against humanity, against our own nature. And so my question to you, Jeremy, is how do we transform the world, and preferably with some speed and categorically with peaceable measures, if that is at all possible?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you for that beautiful and profound and wide-ranging just perspective, Twinkle. That was just amazing to hear. And yeah, and I think really this is the question. If you're not asking this question, then it's, I would say, like, what are you missing, basically? Because anyone who sees what's going on and feels engaged in one way or another has to be saying, like, what can we do about this? And well, obviously, there's no one simple answer, clearly. One thing that I feel like the most important thing to begin with is to recognize that as a result of this deep interconnectedness that you described so beautifully, and I took us through in this presentation, is we are not in a spectator sport. What is going on out there is not something that is happening by other people. It's not like some sort of game where we can sort of cheer the good side, the side we're on. We're actually engaged. We're playing it. And just like there was that lovely quote you were giving about every breath, every sense of connection, and like what the Neo-Confucians talked about in terms of the Li, this ocean of Li. We need to realize that actually each of us, when we wake up every morning, we have the choice whether we are going to engage in trying to move towards that life-affirming future or not. And as part of this globally incredibly deeply connected nonlinear system, first thing we need to realize is none of us is going to move the needle in some way where we can see it really clearly. Even like big names, people people become celebrities or whatever, they might have a little bit more of an impact in the short term or whatever, but none of us themselves are the kind of is going to be the one to save where we're going. But every one of us, through working together as part of these interconnected systems, has the potential to actually make something really profound happen. And where I think it's very important to focus on is, a lot of my presentation was about systems thinking and understanding complex systems. And we need to see our whole modern society and where it's headed also as a complex system. And as a complex system, basically, systems go through what are known as phase transitions, where the way in which they cohere at certain times begins to sort of unravel. And when that unravel happens, we talked a little bit about non-linearity. When the unraveling begins to happen, it can happen incredibly fast, and it can move towards a new stable state. And we see that in a terrifying way on things like some of these climate feedback effects, where suddenly more methane gas gets emitted, and that actually leads to further climate breakdown. Or we can see the Amazon might be moving from the stable state of being a tropical rainforest to being savanna. It's actually getting close to that phase transition. But on the positive side, those phase transitions can happen in a civilizational context. Because what I see happening is that as younger generations begin to grow into seeing this world as it is right now, those preconceived ideas that I was critiquing in this presentation, they themselves begin to say, this makes no sense. What my parents' generation is telling me about doesn't make sense. But they're going to be looking around for what does make sense. And this is where I feel what's so crucially important is for those of us who are in older generations and those of us who have done our own thinking to work together to offer coherent, life-affirming alternatives that younger people can like take and run with. And I think in all cases, it's crucial, no matter, even when we're just one part of these systems, it's crucial not to double down on those separations. That as we're seeing things unravel so badly, we're seeing the rise of basically ideologies of separation, like racism and fascism, and increased nationalism and borders and all this stuff. And what is, I think, crucial for all of us to do is not, those of us who want to move toward that life-affirming world, not see those who are politically opponents or whatever as separate, not to dehumanize them, not to see them as the other, but to actually look at the ways in which we can connect with them. Look at the ways in which we can find that shared human understanding, that sense that we all share a sense of wanting to feel like good people, of caring about our grandchildren, of caring about life and nature. And when we can connect with people at deeper layers, that's when we begin to subvert these barriers of separation and actually move towards something that's more life-affirming.
Thank you. That's perfect. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to discuss this directly with you, and I will yield because I see there are a number of people have more questions for you. Thank you. Thank you, Gail.
Yeah, Twinkle, thank you so much. That was a beautiful response. Really, really great. Interaction was nice, Jeremy. Let's go on to the questions now. And I want to remind people in the audience to feel like you can add the questions to the Q&A. So first one, is there any value in the concept of enlightened self-interest? Is it a viable alternative to human greed? Is it possible for there ever to be enough human enlightenment without pervasive, effective education?
Yeah, a great question. And well, in a way, I would say that in general, as human beings and just basically as living organisms, we actually, we all have enlightened self-interest within us. That there's this kind of notion that came a lot from this, that sort of concept of the selfish gene, that somehow that to be focused on ourself is, it leads us to selfishness. And we can either say, well, that's either good if we're believing in the neoliberal ideology that greed is good, as we looked at, or we can say that's bad and we have to overcome it and become more enlightened or whatever. But we can look at things from a very different way. And it's there's a phrase that I have that I write about in this book, The Web of Meaning, that I call fractal flourishing, that I took you through some of these concepts, which is this recognition that once we realize that we live in what's known as a holarchy. A holarchy basically is a self-contained system that's part of a bigger self-contained system, which is part of something even bigger, just like we looked at. And once we begin to realize that that is the world in which we live, and our identity is not some separate sort of autonomous shell, but actually being part of this greater sense of connectivity, then what begins to see that there's no actual dichotomy between what is good for me and what is good for those around me and what is good for all of life around me. And oftentimes we get into this kind of false sense that there's a zero-sum game out there. And that is really a part of what our dominant system tells us is the case, because then it can basically keep perpetuating the same flaws that we have right now. But I think, so in that sense, like that notion of enlightened self-interest is really to allow us, our identity, our sense of self itself, to become, to break out the bounds that we're told we kind of exist in. And then self-interest becomes the interest of all those around us. We do well when we're in communities that are healthy. There's the studies that have looked at inequality. And what they found is there's an absolute and clear correlation between societies that are more equal and societies where the quality of life is better in virtually every way: health, well-being, psychological health, you name it. And what's fascinating is that in those societies that are more equal, even those who are the wealthier people in those societies are still happier than the people of relative wealth in unequal societies, because they feel good living in a society where people trust each other and where there's a sense of shared dignity and care. And so that's the kind of way in which self-interest can always be enlightened, when we look at ourself as being something bigger than just that separate individual.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. Next question is a little bit long, and I'm going to kind of abbreviate it. Your definition of spirituality as finding meaning in connections rather than things connected is interesting. I'm not sure it gets away from the substantivist thinking, since it may simply be replacing relation for Aristotelian substance. It goes on, says, I wonder if it makes sense to change your definition of spirituality to what it feels like to be or be identified with the relationships between rather than the things related. Perhaps I've misunderstood your point, but would this slight redefinition not be still consistent with your overall thesis, which includes first-person subjectivity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that perspective. And I feel there's definitely room for more than one definition of the word spirituality. And I think that this idea does capture that sense of the feeling tone, because I think that one thing we need to realize is that we are embodied creatures. And so when we look for that connection, that coherent connection between things, it is not just something that's in our minds, and it's something that we actually feel. And so in a sense, we can sort of recognize that sense of it sort of, I like where that question is going, because it also gets past that sort of conceptual or animate dichotomy. You know, when we were looking at the very beginning at that Taoist concept of Wu Wei and Yu Wei, and I think, therefore I am, or I feel, therefore I'm an animal. And the notion is that once we begin to focus on what it feels like to be connected, then that whatever spiritual investigation we're on becomes more embodied, which tends to lead to more of a sense of a compassionate way of relating to others around us. You know, the word compassion itself, but ultimately has this etymology of feeling with. And so that can lead to just the kind of spirituality that basically this world needs in order for that trajectory to change. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really rich addition to that concept.
So another question, how confident are you that we will learn to save ourselves from ourselves?
Yeah, well, honestly, I hate to sort of rain on the parade here, but I'm not confident. I don't know. And I think anybody who's looking at the disastrous trajectory our civilization's on right now, and who will tell you, oh, don't worry, like it's all going to be okay. I think they're, sometimes people call it hopium, that maybe they're smoking or whatever, because if we had to put odds on things, on something like this, maybe the odds might not look so good. But where I get my faith, I mean, really, I feel like almost like I've moved from this very concept of hope itself to more like a sense of faith, because hope oftentimes has this notion of attachment to some future outcome. But it's more than anything, it's this recognition that we live in a non-linear world. We've talked a couple of times now about these phase transitions. And I think it's just like it's a mistake to say, oh, it's all going to be okay. I think it's equally a mistake to say we are doomed, or to say that it's inevitable that we're headed for collapse. Because even though many of the parameters that if we look at really consciously might look like we are heading in that direction, we live in this not just a nonlinear self-organized system, but multiple nonlinear systems. There's the climate system is nonlinear. There's human culture is nonlinear, and those things basically, as they connect with each other, it's almost impossible to predict. We can't know when a 15-year-old girl sits in front of a parliament, like in Sweden a few years ago, and all alone saying, we've got to do something about the climate. Nobody can predict that that girl will become this worldwide celebrity called Greta Thunberg, who then speaks in front of the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, and tells them the truth of what's going on around in the world right now, and can end up maybe catalyzing a movement of millions of people around the world. I do believe that the only way in which the transformation that is needed will happen is when literally millions upon millions, even hundreds of millions of people begin to share that same vision of what's needed. And it's got to come from below. It's got to come from our connected grassroots. And it's got to come from the system as a whole. Like, this is where these kinds of conversations are so important, because we have to offer a new way of making sense of things. So when those millions of people begin to say, I'm not accepting this anymore, there's something that they can share, a new story, a story of life on Earth, a story of meaning, a story for how our civilization can be, that they can believe in. And that's not based on made up myths like our dominant story is, but that's based on actual scientifically valid foundations.
Great. Next question that sort of is related is donut economics a beginning for an answer of togetherness?
Yes, I'm thrilled that donut economics was mentioned, because I do think that it's an absolutely brilliant, transformative way to look at economics. For people who aren't familiar with donut economics, it's actually a book and really an economic concept that's been put out by Kate Raworth, a British economist. And the notion of the donuts, again, for people who don't understand that so well, is basically, very simply, it's like two concentric circles. And the donut is what's between those two concentric circles. And the outer circle, you might remember at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about those planetary boundaries and how we've blown through 5 of those 9 planetary boundaries. Well, the outer circle of that donut are those planetary boundaries. And so what Kate Raworth puts out is one of the goals of any economic system has to be to find ways to stay within those planetary boundaries. So that's the outer circle. But equally importantly, the inner circle is the core, the bare necessities that is needed for every human being to actually live a life of dignity, whether it's like housing they can rely on, food, physical security, education for their children, and basic access to healthcare, or access to meaningful work. All of those different levels, that's the foundation of what a society needs to provide for itself. So then the goal in this new this new kind of formulation of economics, the goal of all economic activity should be to live, for society to live within that donut. It's a brilliant idea, and it's actually become extremely popular in cities such as Amsterdam and other cities around the world have been inspired by it, so that they're now, they have city plans to like work out, how do we have our city work within the donut? And if and when enough countries begin to actually use that as a framework for thinking about economics, we'd be seeing one of the most important transformative changes that we need. So thank you for bringing that into the conversation.
A barrier to the world you describe is the rampant tribalism that we see growing instead of subsiding. How do you think we should address this problem?
Yes, well, I think tribalism is extremely dangerous, and it's very distressing to feel it all around us. And of course, we see that politically, we see that in the culture, and we also see it as a result of social media, which are basically social media is designed just to maximize the amount of advertising revenues these companies can get. And it turns out that whenever somebody makes some statement on Twitter or Facebook, whatever it might be, that is divisive or is even like a lie and false, it ends up getting like 10 times more engagement than something that is thoughtful and true. And so what happens is, because of this profit-driven system, we're actually, these companies actually catalyze and exacerbate the very divisions between people that we need to go in the other direction. So I think there's things we can do on a personal level. There are things we can do in terms of political engagement. On a personal level, like I was talking about earlier, all of us, I'm sure, have had experiences, maybe with people in our family or people, co-workers at work, whatever it might be, where we come across somebody and we just go, oh, they're just driving me crazy. They're like filled with all this, they're saying things that make no sense, and they're closed-minded. And the thing is, this is where it takes a lot of inner work to actually respond skillfully to that person. Because just trying to argue against them and saying, no, you're wrong, you're so stupid, that's actually will be guaranteed not to work. And the smarter the person is, the better educated they are. And scientific studies have shown this. The more they'll come up with their counter arguments to refuse to accept what you say. So the only way, I think, to connect with people like that, that get us sort of irritated or resentful or whatever it might be, is to go to a deeper layer, to look at where we can connect with that person, look at where we can actually share a common understanding, and not try to win an argument, not try to get that person to see it your way by the end of that conversation, but to maybe, if you can leave a conversation with that person where they're just curious about one particular thing, want to investigate it a little bit more, then that's the kind of way in which we can respond to that divisiveness. And then I would just say that at a political level, we need to realize that these massive social media companies, these companies that basically control and dominate our global culture right now, we can't allow them to basically continue this business model of being shareholder-owned, profit-maximizing companies. We need to realize that the data that they have, that the incredibly powerful cultural medium of communication should be viewed of like a utility. In just the same way that electricity or water is a utility, we need to recognize that these companies, they have the technology is of public benefit, and that can't be used to basically destroy the very foundations of a healthy culture. And we have to look at political solutions in that regard too.
Great, thank you. To sort of address a different question or a different problem, as a longtime educator, I am frustrated with the public school system, which, despite some minor tinkering around the edges, seems to be simply perpetuating the current worldview that is rapidly and tragically depriving our children of a life-affirming future. Do you have suggestions for how to accelerate a major phase transition in the public school system?
Yes, I would agree with you. And I'd actually even go further than the public school system. I'd say basically our entire mainstream schooling system, whether it's public schools or private schools, whatever it is actually been designed on the basis not for encouraging human flourishing, not for encouraging us to move towards a sustainable and a healthy world, but to basically feed this kind of corporate machine that is what is actually destroying our world right now. So we need to realize, like, that education right now, it's essentially from the earliest years, the very concept of education is based on distilling a sense of discipline and hierarchy in kids, and sort of taking away their creativity, forcing them to sit at tables and put their hand up if they want to go to the bathroom, or all those elements are instilled in children at a very young age. And then as they move into their teens and then and finally go to get a college level, the whole focus is on telling them that what they need to be doing is finding a way to become part of this machine that is really destroying the earth through the consumption and production that we looked at earlier. So find a way to be a successful engineer or marketer or business person, and that's what's valued. So we need to look at changing the very foundations of education so that it begins to instill in children from the earliest stage the qualities to attain well-being. And there's this great distinction that Aristotle made between hedonia and eudaimonia. Hedonia being that sort of short-term looking for whatever the next thing is that can make you feel a bit better. And it's that hedonic treadmill that our system has us on right now. But what education really should be about is setting the foundations for eudaimonia, which involves even at the earliest years in schooling. And some countries like Scandinavian countries are doing this, actually having sessions of teaching kids the capacity for compassion and for altruistic thinking and for empathic thinking and for empathic ways of relating, and then connecting with nature, and then moving to more of kind of themes of like an eco-education, recognizing that we're a part of these living systems, learning to think in systems. These are all concepts that can actually be taught to children at quite a young age. They seem to be very complex in the sense that those of us who get raised in this more reductionist education have to kind of change our minds to think about it. But kids naturally make those connections because that's how we are as human beings. So those are some of the fundamental ways in which education needs to be changed. That's more on the philosophical as opposed to the political sphere. But hopefully that's kind of a helpful foundation.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. This is going to be our last question. What do you think of accepting the self-organizing forces of nature as solutions to global problems?
You know, there's this great concept of biomimicry that has this idea that we need to look at what nature has has done in terms of solving problems and learn from that and apply them ourselves. And so you can look at you can look at the way in which geckos stick to the wall or whatever, and I kind of learn, oh wow, we can learn from that nature's secrets and apply that ourselves. So that's a beautiful idea, but it's needs to break out of certain limits, because we can apply in a kind of more superficial way. We can apply that sort of looking for nature's solutions. If we apply that within this capitalist framework that I've been describing, what ends up happening is that we just use it then to then consume even more, or make somebody the next billionaire because this great company they created. What I think we can learn and must learn from nature is looking at the deepest layers of what nature tells us. For example, you remember that slide I showed, that the great breakthroughs in evolution over billions of years came about through increased cooperation, and in particular through the development of mutually beneficial symbiosis. Well, if we can begin to look at the human impact on the earth in that way, and actually say, not like, how can we use technology to accomplish this goal or to this end, but how can we use technology to be mutually beneficial with nature? How can we actually develop technologies that give us not just what we want, but what nature wants too? We begin to start looking at things in fundamentally different ways. And that can lead to the foundation of this concept that energizes me a lot. In fact, I'm writing a book on this very notion of what's actually called an ecological civilization. The idea of what would it look like if we actually redesigned literally our civilization from the ground up, and rather than being one that's based on profit maximization, exploitation, and extraction, if it's one that's actually based on the principles that have allowed ecosystems to thrive, sometimes for millions of years, through that self-organized sense. And things like that mutually beneficial symbiosis, things like fractal flourishing, things like integration, applying all the differentiation, all the different parts of the world, but as part of a unified whole. Those are some of the core concepts that we can begin to look at designing a life-affirming civilization on.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. We were not able to get through all the questions, but there are a few comments here that might be useful to you. So we'll pass on the chat or the Q&A so that you might be able to use it for the future. Let me just once again thank you, Jeremy, and also Twinkle for an outstanding session for us. It was really great.